Hello, everyone. Welcome to Module 4. So far, we've talked about developing a social media strategy, establishing goals and objectives, and using paid, earned, shared, and owned media. This week, we're going to focus on another critical part of the strategy, and that is your target audience. Before you can decide what to say, where to say it, or even what type of content to create, you need to understand exactly who you're trying to reach. Your target audience really informs every part of your social media strategy. It can influence your goals, your messaging, the content you create, the platforms you select, your paid media decisions, and even the KPIs you use to measure success. This is why audience research cannot be an afterthought. Your strategy should begin with a clear understanding of who you're trying to reach. So, what exactly is a target audience? Your target audience is the specific group of people that your brand or organization wants to reach. These are people who are more likely to have a need or interest related to your product, service, or message. They may also be more likely to engage with your content or take the action you want them to take. We can define an audience using several characteristics, including demographics, psychographics, behavior needs, and interest. One of the most important things to remember is that your target audience is not everyone. When you try to create a message that appeals to everyone, it can become so broad that it doesn't connect strongly with anyone. You may begin with a fairly broad audience, but your job as a strategist is to narrow and refine that audience based on your research. You want to identify the people who are most relevant to what you're trying to accomplish. The more clearly you understand them, the more relevant your communication can become. Let's look at a simple example. Imagine that you're developing a social media strategy for a child care center. You may initially say that your audience is parents, but that's extremely broad. We could narrow that to parents between the ages of 25 and 40, but we can go even further. Perhaps our research tells us that our primary audience is working parents between 25 and 40 with children under the age of 5 who live or work within 10 miles of the child care center. Notice what happens as we become more specific. We begin to get a much clearer picture of who we're communicating with, and that allows us to make better strategic decisions. There are three important ways we're going to think about audience in this module. First, we have demographics, which help us understand who they are. Then we have psychographics, which help us understand what matters to them. And finally, we have behavior, which tells us what they actually do. When we bring these three types of information together, we get a much richer understanding of our audience than we would from demographics alone. Let's start with demographics. These are characteristics such as age, geographic location, gender, income, education, family status, and occupation. But here's something important to remember. You don't need to include every possible demographic characteristic simply because the information is available. Ask whether that characteristic actually matters to your strategy. For example, geographic location may be extremely important for a local restaurant or childcare facility, but it might be less important for a company selling digital products globally. The demographic characteristics you select should help you better understand or reach your audience. Demographics tell us something about who our audience is, but they don't necessarily tell us what motivates them. That's where psychographics become important. Psychographics include things like values, attitudes, interest, lifestyle, motivation, aspirations, beliefs, and priorities. Two people can be the same age, live in the same city, and have similar incomes, but respond very differently to the same message because they have completely different values and interests. So, as you conduct your audience analysis, don't stop at asking who your audience is. Ask what matters to them and why. For social media strategy, behavioral information is particularly valuable because we want to understand what people actually do. Which platforms are they using? What kinds of content are they watching or reading? What do they search for? What do they share or save? When are they active? How do they discover new brands or products? And how do they make purchasing decisions? We can also examine how they currently interact with our own brand. Remember, what people actually do can sometimes tell us more than what they say they do. Another important part of understanding your audience is identifying their pain points. A pain point is essentially a problem, frustration, challenge, or unmet need that your audience experiences. You want to ask what problem the audience has, why that problem matters to them, and how they're currently trying to solve it. You should also consider what might be preventing them from solving it. Then we turn the question back to the brand. How can our product, service, or even our content provide meaningful value? Effective communication should make some connection between what the audience needs and what the brand can genuinely offer. So, how do we actually find all this information? There isn't one single source. We can conduct primary research through surveys, interviews, focus groups, or customer feedback. We can use digital and social data, including social listening, platform analytics, website analytics, search behavior, and existing customer data. We can also use secondary research from sources such as the US Census, Pew Research Center, industry reports, ESRI, and competitor research. The important thing is that we're using evidence. We don't want to sit in a meeting and simply decide who we think our audience is. Social media gives us another major advantage because we can learn from what audiences actually say and do online. Through social listening, we can identify conversations, questions, complaints, sentiment, emerging topics, and even what people are saying about our competitors. Platform analytics can tell us something different. We can examine audience characteristics, content preferences, engagement patterns, traffic, conversions, and performance over time. Together, these sources allow us to listen before we speak, and that can make our communication much more relevant. Of course, we also need to talk about AI. AI can support audience research in several ways. It can help with social listening, sentiment analysis, identifying patterns, segmenting audiences, synthesizing research, identifying trends, and analyzing large amounts of data. But I want you to remember an important distinction. AI should help you analyze your audience. It should not invent your audience. If you simply ask an AI tool to tell you who your target audience should be without providing reliable research or data, you may end up building a strategy around assumptions. AI can help us work with information, but human judgment is still necessary. This helps validate those insights, understand context, and make strategic decisions. As you're defining your audience, there are several questions that can help you refine your thinking. What does your product or service do particularly well? Who actually needs or values what you're offering? What problem are you solving? Who can realistically access or afford the product or service? Where can you serve them? You should also look outside the organization. Who are your competitors targeting? And what makes your product or your offering different? These questions help us move from simply describing an audience to thinking strategically about why that audience makes sense for the brand. Now, audience definition is also an ongoing process. As you gather more information, you may discover that your original audience actually contains several meaningful segments. You might identify a primary audience, which includes the people who are most important to achieving your goals. You may also have a secondary audience, which could include people who influence the primary audience, support the decision, or also benefit from the message. And I want to correct an idea that sometimes come up when we are talking about targeting. The goal isn't simply to make your audience smaller and smaller. The goal is to make it more relevant. Your audience should be specific enough to guide your strategy, but large enough to make sense for what you're trying to accomplish. Once you understand your broader target audience, you may also develop an audience persona. There is a difference between the two. Your target audience describes the broader group you're trying to reach. A persona is a research informed representation of someone within that audience. A persona might include that person's goals, needs, pain points, motivations, media habits, content preferences, and decision behaviors. This can help your team imagine how someone within the target audience might interact with your communication. But personas should always be grounded in evidence. We don't want to create fictional profiles based on stereotypes and then mistake those assumptions for audience research. Now, I want you to apply what we've discussed. Think about a brand that you follow on social media. Based on the content that brand publishes, who do you think they're trying to reach? Look for demographic clues, but don't stop there. What values, interests, or lifestyles seem to be reflected in the content? What behaviors does the brand appear to be responding to? What pain points, needs, or desires does the content address? Also, think about the platforms the brand uses. Most importantly, ask yourself what evidence supports your conclusions? That's the difference between making an assumption about an audience and conducting audience analysis. Above all, audience insight should inform your goals, messages, content, platform choices, media decisions, and measurement. Remember that demographics help us understand who the audience is. Psychographics help us understand what matters to them. Behavioral data tells us what to do. Pain points help us understand what they need. And research allows us to continually test and refine what we think we know. Ultimately, the better you understand your audience, the more relevant and strategic your communication can become. Throughout the module, I've included several resources that can support your audience research, including Pew Research Center, the US Census Bureau, ESRI, and the VALS Consumer Segmentation Framework. As you move into professional practice, remember that audience research isn't something you conduct once and never revisit. Audiences change, platforms change, behaviors change, and the tools available to us, including AI, will continue to change as well. Your job as a strategist is to use current and credible information. Continue listening to your audience and allow what you learn to inform your communication decisions.